Ladies and gentlemen, this is the 12th and final round.
Right hand, Golovkin steps in and down he goes again. Unbelievable. Mayweather makes him pay. What a rookie mistake. A sensational left hook by De La Hoya.
It's fact. I'm the best. You know what I mean? Sometimes I don't want to believe it myself, but it's the truth. I'm the best. I'm going to show you how great I am.
From Southern California, this is the Last Round Podcast.
Welcome to a bonus episode of the Last Round Podcast. And returning for, I think, the third time, we have Patrick Connor. And today we're going to be reviewing his new book, Shot at a Brothel, The Spectacular Demise of Oscar Ringo Bonavena. Thank you, Patrick, for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me again. Yeah, I guess third time's a charm. Third time's the time that we talk about my book. So thank you. Appreciate it.
Right. So before we kind of delve into the book, just kind of tell us, who is Patrick O'Connor and how did you, get into the boxing / true crime type of, media side, I guess?
Well, I guess I would say, like a lot of people, I've been a boxing fan since my teens. A lot of people much younger, much longer, but I've been a boxing fan a long time. And I started out fairly early on in the game when forums and message boards were kind of just starting to really take hold, like the last days of chat rooms and stuff like that. They didn't do those quite as much anymore, and I started getting into posting on message boards and forums, and eventually, because of my enthusiasm and because of, I guess, just the way I talk and stuff, people were like, why don't you write? Why don't you do this and that? I never really considered it seriously until a buddy of mine had a boxing blog, started writing at his boxing blog, and it just kind of evolved from there. I got a lot of luck, a lot of opportunities I totally did not deserve whatsoever, and luckily was able to take advantage of some of those opportunities. So that led me to writing for a handful of years, usually about boxing history. That's kind of my forte or my interest. So that's why I write about the historical side of boxing. But a few years ago, because I also run a couple social media accounts that have to do with boxing history, and in particular, on this day and such year, I make posts like that every so often. And a while back, it was the anniversary of Muhammad Ali versus Oscar Bonavena. And I had been researching that fight, and then kind of clicked in my head, what happened to Oscar Bonavena? Didn't he have some sort of weird thing happen to him, or what happened to that guy? And sure enough, I looked and I got some pretty basic preliminary information as far as what happened to him, and just really started researching, downloading dozens of articles, maybe a couple hundred articles about what had happened from local newspapers around Reno. And I kind of forgot about it, didn't really read too far into the articles. And very shortly afterwards, I was contacted by the guys at Hamilcar Publications about first doing a podcast for them. And then once they started kind of Googling me, I guess, they were like, wait, you do writing? Wait a second, you wrote about some crime stuff. That's what we're doing. So would you consider writing? And I told them about Oscar Bonavena, and they were like, that's exactly the kind of stuff we want. So I think the interest in the true crime, if you are interested in the history of boxing, you're going to come across the corruption and the crime sooner or later. There's nothing you can do about that. So I definitely knew something about the true crime in boxing. And I think that there's just a tendency towards, I don't know if it's cynicism or what, but a tendency toward an interest in that. And that just wound up serendipitously meeting with the Hamilcar guys timing wise. And that's kind of how it all began, I guess. I mean, taking it back a little too far at the beginning there, but hey, that's just the evolution of the social media and boxing stuff,
I think I'm right in saying this is your first book.
Yes, it is. I guess it was kind of a long time coming, but yeah, made it happen, thankfully.
So obviously, I've never written a book, and I'm sure there's many of our listeners that have never written a book. Can you just tell us about the process, from obviously them reaching out, contacting you, choosing the subject, you know, how long it is you get to before it goes to press, and, you know, etc.?
I think generally speaking, so again, I got pretty lucky, and I've gotten lucky a number of times with opportunities that I've kind of stumbled across or been given. And this was not much of an exception. I think generally speaking, most authors or writers looking to get a book published often wind up writing a book or writing much of a book enough so that they can pitch it to a publisher. And often writers wind up shopping around at publishers, getting rejected a lot too. That's kind of almost a stereotypical part of the process of being an author, being a prospective author. And so as I understand, there's a lot of that, a lot of trial and error, a lot of kind of putting your feelers out and not getting anything back. And luckily I did not have to experience that. And I was more or less approached by Hamilcar. I think because I guess because of my knowledge of boxing history, but also because I seem to understand how social media moves a little bit better than some. I'm kind of stuck right at the perfect age where I'm not old yet, and I understand what's going on social media, but I'm old enough to have experience having done some of this writing stuff and media stuff in boxing. So it was a nice marriage, a nice meeting or whatever. So I got lucky, and I definitely would not expect that most writers get that opportunity. And especially if you're shopping around or trying to get a book published that's much larger than mine, because Shot at a Brothel is a fairly short book, pretty easy read, I think. I think it's about 125 pages, roughly 128 pages. Yeah, it's pretty thin, but it has a lot of information. It's just that I think most people would be looking to get a more full-length book pitched, I suppose. So that might be a little bit more difficult, but nonetheless, yeah, it's a pretty cool process, especially the writing and editing part, and seeing everything transform, putting things down on paper, and then that trial and error. It's definitely partly frustrating, but getting to the end, and especially hearing from people who seem to really enjoy the book is really cool.
Research, obviously, because of Oscar Bonavena being, you know, a foreign fighter, how hard is it trying to, you know, gather information, and, you know, how good is your Spanish?
Luckily, my Spanish it's passable. I would not say I'm fluent, but I'm pretty conversational. And so being able to understand some foreign language sources was definitely helpful, for sure. However, getting a hold of them is the problem. Getting stuff shipped from Argentina is, for instance, not easy. It's expensive. I wound up finding all sorts of magazines that Bonavena was featured in, but getting like a magazine from Argentina, because most of the time it was different sellers. It wasn't like somebody who had a big stack of them. And getting one magazine would be like 30, 35, 40, 45 bucks. And I was like, I can't afford to get like 10, 15 of those things like I would like to. That if it were a perfect world, I would have gotten everything. But getting a hold of those things was unfortunately difficult enough that I had to kind of look at that and say, well, there are going to be facts and details that I'm going to have to just let go of. And that's kind of unlike me, but I want to put down everything I find out. But at the same time, I had to just let those go because they were too difficult to come by. And for instance, there were a couple of other books, I think 3 books written about Oscar Bonavena by Argentine writers. But again, getting a hold of them was like $150, $200 plus shipping. I can't, no, that's not going to happen. I don't have that much money. So it was difficult. It was difficult getting a hold of those kinds of sources. But I think the flip side of that, and I guess spinning it into a positive, is that I do know that those other books that included Bonavena or were written about them definitely excluded much of the American perspective on Bonavena. So I guess that's a pretty American-centric thing to say, but it's not that I believe the American perspective is better or anything. It's just that those were kind of omitted. from the Argentine perspective, which when it comes to Oscar Bonavena's death was very tabloid, very like supermarket rag magazine style. A lot of it was a lot of conjecture and speculating. So being able to kind of approach it based more on like factual news reports or presumably factual news reports was a different approach. And I think that it turned out well.
Without giving away too much about the book itself, can you just give us a quick rundown on the two main characters, Oscar Bonavena obviously being the first, and then Joe Conforte?
I think Oscar Bonavena being obviously the central character, because it's his journey. It's exactly, the book kind of details just enough of his family backstory so that I think that you can understand not only where he's coming from, but where a lot of families in Buenos Aires were coming from, and like culturally. And he's an Italian. Oscar Bonavena was Italian, just like a ton of people in Argentina, ethnically Italian, but also very strong pride in being from Argentina. So you have a guy who grew up and had some physical issues growing up, but then wound up kind of growing into like a large child. And that's a lot of what this story kind of centers on, is this large child who is having difficulty relating to the people around him, regardless of who they are. And so, there's definitely some psychology behind that, especially now in the 21st century, that we've kind of become more aware of mental illness. Basically, I think there are a lot of instances in the book where you kind of point to it and go, man, that's weird. But then you put him into a boxing ring, and you put a character like that into a boxing ring, and that's not something that we're not used to seeing. We're used to seeing all sorts of just gnarly out there characters in boxing, and he's no exception. And then you grind them down through boxing and crazy things happen. And then you introduce this other character in Joe Conforte, who is very much a small town gangster. Whereas you think of gangsters and mobsters and stuff like that, you're generally going to gravitate toward somebody from Boston or Jersey or New York or Philadelphia or something like that. That's the typical gangster. And that's not to say that Joe Conforte was or wasn't one of these people in terms of like reputation, but it's just that it's different in a small town. And it's different when it's one of those kinds of mobster people who's pushing up on a small town. And, a lot of people, especially in America, know what small towns do. Like they eat outsiders alive. And so that's kind of like the situation, is we have very volatile situation with these two characters just on their own, and you throw them together and something's going to happen. So it was, figuring out how these two characters relate to each other was definitely a part of the challenge in writing the book.
Whilst you were doing your research, how popular was, Oscar back home in Argentina or even Italy? And was there a comparison about, was he more popular maybe in Italy, or was he more popular back in Argentina?
He made a few visits to Italy, and as I understand, he was somewhat popular there, but it was more of or I guess I should say, I'm not certain whether it was because of the fights he had already had against the names he'd already had, and so he had become popular there. Or, I don't think he had a following in Italy, but perhaps he did. But in Argentina, he was huge. And he was already in news stories and on the covers of magazines before he even turned professional. And I think that especially when there are countries who are not used to having contenders or potential contenders, like for instance, in the heavyweight division, you don't see a lot of Argentine heavyweights. You're more likely to see, we've seen more Argentine heavyweights than we've seen like Mexican heavyweights at the top levels, generally speaking. whatever that reason is, I don't know. But either way, it's kind of like when a certain country or certain region doesn't have a lot of representation above a certain weight class, there's a lot of there's like a mad dash to support these fighters. And there's really no difference, I guess, in America either. I don't want to make it up like about that, but it's just that I think that, I guess, the heavyweights are entrancing to a lot of people. And the idea of having a heavyweight champion in your country is like, that's just kind of turns the dollar signs in people's heads. And there was no exception with Oscar Bonavena. He was not that tall. He was like 6'1", but he was very broad, was very large muscled. And you could tell like he was not going to be making under heavyweight anytime that soon. And he wasn't a massive heavyweight, but he wasn't going to be cutting weight. So it was clear from a pretty early stage in his career that he was going to be a big fighter. And that excited a lot of people. And then on top of that, you add in that he was just like uncultured. I don't know how else to describe it, except that like I said earlier, he was a big kid and he was never acting right in public. And that's the kind of thing where people just want to stare and people want to read about it and people want to laugh about it. And that's what it became very quickly.
Do you think that Oscar was, maybe misunderstood? Because when you read it, you just come across with all the pranks and the bully and the alpha male attitude. But like you just touched on, do you think it was just because he was a giant child and just didn't grow up?
I think that, yeah. Well, and it was difficult writing about this because I didn't want to come from an angle where I was saying, look at this guy, he's so bad, especially because we already know what the end of the story is. So he's already dead. What's the point of telling the story about how he died and the entire time going, look at this guy, let's go watch him die. There were a lot of moments too where he clearly had a lot of love for his family. He loved kids. He was often hanging around kids if there were kids to hang around with, which kind of points to another portion or another kind of prong on that acting like a big child angle, where he just never really seems to grow up. And so when you kind of look at it in that context, it seems a little less mean, a little less malicious, and a little bit more, yeah, like you said, misunderstood, or perhaps somebody who could have along the way used some sort of help that he never got. And I mean, I don't want to like preach like psychiatry or anything like that, but just nonetheless, it kind of begs the question. A lot of the things that happen in the book, I think that when you look at it through a more modern lens, there's a lot of stuff to kind of ask there.
I'm trying to think. I was just looking at a question I was going to ask you, then I just lost it.
Yeah, no problem.
There we go. Obviously, like you touched on, you kind of know what happens in the end. Obviously the title itself kind of tells you what happens. But was there anything that surprised you though, whilst you were writing the book?
There was a lot of stuff that surprised me. I think that there was a lot of going back and forth with writing it and editing it and putting it together. Some authors might have a far more clear path or organized path as far as what they're doing, or like, they might outline it out a lot more detailed than I did. For me, I kind of just was like, all right, well, I know basically the story, let's just start writing this out. And so the first version or two they weren't very good. But once I, figured out how to get this out, how to kind of reverse engineer that story, that was kind of the trick, trying to figure out how to make it interesting, despite the fact what the ending is. And so being able to kind of tell that story, there was so much research. that I started to kind of feel overwhelmed because of how much came out. And I was starting to feel like, well, I can't get this all in there. It's going to be a fairly short book. And so I don't know how to cram this all in there or what to leave out. And on top of that, the more research I did, it was like I was doing layers of research, kind of being reminded like, oh yeah, dang, I forgot to look about that. And that would like unlock this new, like, holy shit, I never realized that Joe Conforte was involved with that person. Oh, that changes a lot. And that kind of thing, where I was going through and kind of like had to stop and go, well, dang, that changes how I think about exactly how the timing of this goes. And so that kind of thing was it was tough. And that was, I think, where the editing came in. A lot of the editing came in with figuring out the timing and figuring out how to make this interesting despite knowing what the ending is. And so there's a lot there that I think is going to satisfy both true crime fans, especially because of Conforte. Anyone who knows about true crime and mobster stuff on the West Coast, Conforte's name is going to pop up sooner or later. And so they probably will at least know his name. And nonetheless, there's going to be a lot of things that they don't know about him that pop up. I can almost guarantee it. And then there's going to be a lot of things that even pretty hardcore boxing fans, don't know about Oscar Bonavena. They're going to be reading it and going, oh, wow, I didn't realize that. So I think that there's a good overlap, and it provides for definitely a learning experience. At least I hope.
Any good stories that didn't make the book that you'd like to share with us?
Let's see. Actually, there was. Hold on one sec. I'm sorry. Someone just tried to call me, and it like, all right, it tries to take over. It's not happening. Not happening. Not while Bonavena's on, people.
Right.
So, actually, I was laughing about this the other day because I wound up reading 2 textbooks, perhaps not 100%, but pretty damn close. And the textbooks were about the economic development of Argentina. So anyway, read,
I imagine
it was not easy. At some points it got pretty interesting because it wasn't just the economics, and it was a lot of social stuff with socioeconomics and cultural impact and whatnot. But even so, it was a lot of reading because I kind of just I had it in my head that I needed to know about this stuff. So there was a lot of perhaps not boxing stories, but there was a lot of stories about how Argentina, and this particular part of Argentina that Oscar Bonavena was from, developed. And that might not be super interesting to boxing fans, but I felt like I needed to know where he was coming from. I felt like I needed to know what the possible motivations were and what the conditions were around where he lived, because Oscar Bonavena came from, like a lot of people around this neighborhood, Parque Patricios, he came from poverty. He lived in a bad, squalid situation growing up. And that's a very common story in boxing, as we know. Just coming from poor conditions is kind of the name of the game. And anyway, so reading about the economic development about this particular place was very fascinating, especially because his dad, who was a cable car driver, or a cable car operator, there's a lot of things in their family story that was interesting to me. So they just didn't make it into the book because it's only 128 pages. And if this would have been like a full length biography or something, of course they would have made it in, but it wasn't. And so there was a lot of also other Argentine boxing history, like ancient Argentine, not ancient, but late 1800s, early 1900s kind of stuff. History of boxing in Argentina that just didn't make the cut either, because it was pertinent to me, but it was just taking up space in the book if I tried to jam it in there. And there was more to the Conforte and Bonavena story that I needed to put in there.
I bet you came across some surprising stuff when you looked into Joe Conforte.
Man, that Joe Conforte in my earlier versions of the book didn't come through nearly as much as he should have. And that was the mistake that I thankfully corrected. Understanding where he comes into the narrative and where he should come in and how was big. And I think that I made the correct choice in that regard. But I very quickly realized that I had like 500 and something articles about Oscar Bonavena and his career and death. And I had like a couple dozen about Joe Conforte. And at first I thought like, oh, well, that should do. And I realized super quickly that that was not going to be the case. And I had to go back and pretty much do the exact same thing for Joe Conforte that I did for Oscar Bonavena. I had to know where he was from. I had to know what the conditions were, where was he from this year to this year, and that kind of thing. I needed to kind of understand better. And the more I dug into it, it was like his name was the most popular name in Reno for years and years and years. And even after Oscar Bonavena was shot, it was like people couldn't get enough of Joe Conforte. Even now, his name is still big in Reno. People still have an opinion of what happened with Oscar Bonavena, or have some sort of weird, theory about what they think happened. So it's there was so many things that popped up with Joe Conforte. I put almost everything that I can find in there, but some stuff obviously couldn't make the grade. It was just that he was such a busy, like weasel, like a small time mobster wannabe type, that he was always getting into something. Everything from like arson to stuff even much more serious than that. And it was all making the paper. It was nuts, dude. It was the amount of material on Joe Conforte was just insane.
It's no surprise the mob, gambling, boxing, just they all go hand in hand.
They really do. I guess on the Joe Conforte side, as far as stuff that couldn't quite make the book, there was some connections between Lake Tahoe and Reno and the development of Lake Tahoe and Reno. A lot of people know about how Vegas started and the mob connection in Vegas. And there's no difference between Vegas and Lake Tahoe and Reno. All of these cities, these gambling cities, were developed with mob money, with icky stuff. That's just kind of how it happened. And Reno is where Joe Conforte was no exception. It was just kind of a question of where they had gone, like what was running Reno and who was running Reno around this time. So, excuse me, some of that history didn't quite make the book, but you didn't really need to even know some of that stuff, I suppose. It was just that his name came up so much. It's almost like you read through the book, and I even reading back was like, is that true? Damn, I need to go relook that. Make sure, yeah, no, that's true. There's the article right there. It's pretty unbelievable at times. Did you get a chance to go out to Reno for the book? No, unfortunately not. The pandemic hit, and when the pandemic hit, that changed like everything. I had the first couple drafts of the book done like a while ago, and throughout pretty much of the pandemic has been like the editing process and delays and stuff like that because of the pandemic and blah blah blah. So I haven't had a chance to go out there. I would love to at some point, and I know, to my knowledge, at least up until recently, Mustang Ranch, the brothel that Joe Conforte was the owner of, or at least the last brothel that he was the owner of, because there were several iterations before that. I think it's still open as like a tourist area. There are other operable, open brothels in different areas that I know of in Nevada, but yeah, I'd love to go out there at some point. I'm sure all the men that are listening are probably wondering, how many brothels did you visit just for research? Well, I have to form a proper opinion. I can't just this is the kind of stuff, this is immersive. This is the kind of thing where you go undercover, Michael, right.
So the title of the book, Shot at a Brothel, is that something you decided to pick? Because it's definitely one of those titles where if you're in a bookshop and you're just scanning the shelves looking for a new book, it would definitely stop you, and make you, take a second glance, like, what the hell's going on here?
I wish I could take credit for that, but that was the editor, Kyle Serafine. He came up with, unless there's somebody else who's had a hand in one or two of the titles, he comes up with the titles. And it's really perfect because it's not only catchy, it's not only catchy in the sense that, like you said, you see it in a bookstore and you're like, oh, what, brothel, shot, what happened? But apart from that, apart from the catchiness of it and catching your eye, it's like it's entering it into the public record. You know what I'm saying? Like, it's like you see Oscar Bonavena's photo on it, and even if you're just passing by and you just kind of take note mentally, all of a sudden now Oscar Bonavena was shot at a brothel. It's like, it's genius. It's seriously genius. So I got to give Kyle credit for that. But yeah, and I think that it also describes what's inside the book perfectly too, because the word brothel, I mean, whether you want to be PC or some shit or not, the point is that it's going to stir up some thoughts. It's going to stir up some emotions. And I definitely included some of that stuff in there because that's part of this world. There's definitely a couple passages in there that I think you probably wouldn't want to read aloud to your grandma, but or your younger children for that matter. But either way, it's true crime. That's the whole point, is that it's, this is not fantasy. This is real shit that happened.
Obviously, we just touched on, obviously you couldn't get out to Reno due to COVID. Is there anybody that you would have liked to have spoken to for the book?
Mills Lane, actually, he had a stroke a few years ago, so that it's not going to happen. And I would never press ever. But just in a perfect world and in an ideal world, it would have been really great to talk to Mills Lane, because apart from his boxing involvement, he had already done some refereeing and I know some judging. By the time Oscar Bonavena was killed in 1976, he had already had some experience in the working with the boxing commission. However, a lot of people remembered him from the Mike Tyson-Holyfield rematch, the bite fight. And then immediately afterward, he capitalized on his fame by trademarking Let's Get It On, starting a promotional company. And then a lot of people thought, oh, he became a judge and he's got a TV show. He actually had been a judge for a long time. And he, before that, was a district attorney in Reno. And he was actually involved in several of Joe Conforte's cases. And so I would have loved to talk to Mills Lane, because he is an extremely no BS dude who would have just laid it down. And that would have been awesome. But like I said, is unfortunately, that's not an option. Also, there were supposedly people who were relatives, for instance, the shooter, Ross Breimer, the guy who, well, I should say allegedly shot Oscar Bonavena. His son was, I think he might have passed away or perhaps gotten sent to prison. I don't want to say those are the same thing, but I know he was big in the news somewhat recently. And that would have been good to talk to him, because, just kind of getting the feel for his dad. But otherwise, the unfortunate thing is the vast majority of the characters in this book are dead. The vast majority of the people, Joe Conforte actually just died. I think it was last year, believe it or not. Yeah. It was either early 2020 or late 2019. And he was like off, hidden away somewhere in Brazil. So, I mean, it was like the absolute lack of people to interview and talk to, apart from people who were like news people who heard about X, Y, or Z, which, don't get me wrong, I don't want to downplay that, but it's like, well, I read what you wrote already in the newspaper, for the most part. But even so, there was like one person. That's it. And I contacted a few other people who were involved in the news around the area that never got back to me. So the lack of people to actually speak with about this and get new material was frustrating. And that's what led to such a research heavy book. But it would have been cool to talk to, just about anybody really.
Do you have a personal favorite part of the book?
I think that for me, it's kind of like there's a part of the book when Joe Conforte is kind of just getting started in Reno. And you can see that, like, I think that I described Oscar Bonavena as a rascal a few times. And you can see that kind of tendency in Joe Conforte too. It's like almost before stuff starts getting really bad or big in Reno, you can see that it's almost like it's this young businessman with a glimmer in his eye type of shit. So it's almost like briefly, just for a little bit, like Joe Conforte, like he was just a guy trying to, I guess, get into business in a way that was to many people salacious or bad or wrong. And that's not to downplay the exploitative nature of prostitution, but nonetheless, you can almost see that, like I said earlier with Oscar Bonavena, that he was human, that there were other sides to the story. There were deeper parts to it. Same thing with Conforte, that they were complex human beings. They couldn't just be nailed down to a few sentences. So I thought that was kind of cool to get a better sense of who he was, especially because he had an autobiography that I read through. And I mean, it was like, you might as well just not have read it, because it was like a guy just making crazy claims about himself, claim after claim. So it was cool to kind of get a better idea of who this younger version of Joe Conforte might have been.
After spending months and months and months, I assume, of the research and having Oscar on the mind the whole time, what was your final conclusion of Oscar as a person?
That's a good question. I guess I think that I don't want to dismiss that. I don't want to dismiss who he was, and I don't want to make excuses for the bad things he did. But it does kind of seem as though in some ways he's like a little bit of a victim. I mean, obviously a victim of the shooting, but a victim in life. And that it kind of looks the opposite, because kind of like maybe Mike Tyson, that's an easy example, right? Mm-hmm. He's big, he's scary. He fucking kills people in the ring. But then you talk to him and he's like, whether or not he's honest, I suppose, is another story, but it seems to me he's being honest. And I don't know why he would say things like he said, like he was so frightened. Mm-hmm. That's why he was that way. And it was I kind of saw the same type of thing in Oscar Bonavena, where he was always messing with people and he's always lashing out and he's always loud and getting the attention because he was like insecure, because there was something going on in his head that was like, he needed that extra, again, this is just kind of dime store psychology on my part, but to me, it seemed as though there might be some victim there and that he wasn't as bad or mean as it often seemed, or that it might be that perhaps he was as bad or mean, but there were other external factors that like you have to consider. So, I thought that he definitely winds up a very interesting character. And it was kind of like the initial question I was asking myself when I first started this it was almost like I needed to know, like, and as sick as this might sound, right? Like I needed to know, like, did he deserve it? Like, did he have this shit coming like in the moment? Like, was he threatening somebody and this is what happened because he was a threat to somebody? Or did he screw so many people over that like karma wise, this was just coming? And those were like questions I wanted to ask I wanted to answer really, but I guess with anything that happened in the past and it's enough time removed, you're never going to get a solid answer or a concrete answer. But nonetheless, I think I got pretty close. I feel like I got pretty close to answering those.
Any more books in mind? Any future ones coming up?
None coming up per se, but I definitely have some ideas and stuff I'm working on for sure, but nothing inked out yet.
Are they going to be like a true crime boxing?
That's a good question. Definitely boxing. And I actually might be branching out into one other genre per request, but I'll keep everybody abreast going with the brothel theme.
If you could just tell Patrick, everybody where they can find it, all the different websites they can pick the book up at.
Yeah, I think Amazon would probably be the best place to grab it, but you can grab it just about anywhere else books are available, or you can request it pretty much anywhere else books are available too. But Amazon would be the primary place to get Shot at a Brothel.
If you want to share all of your social media handles, your podcast, your websites with everybody.
Yes, please. If I probably am primarily on Twitter, and my handle there is Patrick M. Connor, Connor. But I also somewhat notably run the boxing history account there, and also a boxing history page on both Instagram and Facebook, where, like I said earlier, I just share history stuff. And I do run a website, but it's kind of defunct at the moment, Knuckles and Gloves. But that's also the name of my podcast. Sorry to get so confusing, listeners, but Knuckles and Gloves is the podcast. That's probably the primary thing to remember there. But yeah, if you look around for Patrick Connor, you'll probably find me somewhere.
Great. Well, thanks again, Patrick, for joining us today. And obviously we'll be back every Tuesday with our usual fight previews and reviews.
Thanks for supporting and listening to the show. Follow us at The Last Round 12 on social media. Rate, review, and subscribe. This is the Last Round Podcast.